All right, we'll get started. So I'm going to introduce our penultimate speaker for the C-STAR lecture series. So we have one more after Dr. Buchwald, who will be Dr. Adam, who is the organizer of the series. He'll speak last on May 11th. But today we have Dr. Adam Buchwald joining us. He's the Associate in Sciences and Disorders. And he's really interested in the relationship between motor and phonological processing in impaired and unimpaired speakers. And he's going to talk to us today about that topic. So his talk is motor speech production, but not phonological processing or production, improves following motor learning training. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Buchwald. If you have any questions, just wait till the end and we'll go ahead and unmute the mics and we'll take some questions from this comment box as well. If you have any comments throughout, go ahead and write them in the box and we'll turn it over to Dr. Buchwald.
Thank you so much. Just have to bring the right screen for the local people. Okay, so I'm going to talk today about a persistent issue in thinking about speech and language production, which is that of distinguishing phonological and motor processing. So this issue persists because it's pretty important for both theoretical and clinical research. So clinically, there's a lot of attention that's been given to the differential diagnosis of aphasia, which is thought of as an acquired language disorder, and lots of different categories of aphasia will affect phonological processing. So the differential diagnosis of aphasia and apraxia of speech, which is described as a disorder of speech motor planning or speech motor programming. So it's important to be able to distinguish these systems for the differential diagnosis and also for developing targeted intervention for individuals who present with these issues. Theoretically, it's also important for us to understand just the nature and the interaction of the processing mechanisms involved in spoken language production, which involve both of these stages. So it's an important issue, but it's also a complicated issue, which is part of the other reason it persists. So the distinction is complicated clinically because aphasia and apraxia of speech co-occur so greatly that it's really difficult, and there have been attempts to try to find large groups of individuals that have just apraxia, and it's been very difficult to find those individuals. So there's this great overlap, which makes it a little bit more complicated to separate cleanly those two levels of processing and how they get affected by deficits. Theoretically, it's also difficult because the things that are complex phonologically tend to also be complex motorically, and so these things will be vulnerable to errors or vulnerable to slower processing in terms of spoken production. So if you look at something like consonant clusters, which is all I do, you see that there are two segments in the onset of a syllable. That's sort of the idea of what we're looking at. So a word like clinical has the K and the L sounds in the onset. That's considered complex phonologically to assign both of those segments to that syllable position. It's also articulatorily difficult. And so given that someone has a deficit in either of those two levels, you would expect sequences like that to be vulnerable to error. So, a question that people have been asking is, can we distinguish these processing systems? And what I'm going to talk about today is some work from a couple different lines of the work we've done in my lab that's tried to get at this issue and tried to separate these a little bit. So the first line of research I'm going to talk about is some work trying to identify motor error patterns and phonological error patterns in individuals with acquired speech impairment. And the key finding that I'll be presenting, I try to avoid the murder mystery approach to academic talk. So the key finding that I'll be talking about is that motor errors seem to benefit or decrease following a repetition-based training, whereas phonological errors seem not to from just a simple repetition-based training. We'll then move into a second part of this talk where we'll look at sort of how we might be able to enhance these benefits and enhance speech motor learning using non-invasive brain stimulation. Here, the key finding that we're going to look at is that when we use TDCS, which I'll go into a little bit, although I imagine most in here are familiar with it, when we use TDCS, some of the parameters that seem to be useful in promoting speech motor learning match those that promote motor learning from other non-speech motor domains. And I think these two will tell a nice story together, and you'll see how it sort of sets up for the future work that we're doing. So I'm going to begin by talking about work with individuals with acquired speech impairment. The differential diagnosis of apraxia of speech and aphasia has been pretty well studied and widely studied for a number of years. I think the consensus has settled around apraxia of speech. The speech involved tends to be slow, somewhat dysprosodic, contain distortions of both accurate and inaccurately produced segments. A lot of people have been working on that particular issue. There was a great talk in this talk series from about a month ago by Alex Basilakos, and I encourage you to run to YouTube after this talk and to watch that if there's anything that I've left out. So I'm going to not focus on that differential diagnosis as much because I'm also interested in the fact that these problems co-occur so much. We see individuals presenting with both these motor speech problems and these phonological problems, meaning that when they're speaking, errors can arise from different levels as they're trying to produce language. So one of the ways that people have addressed this, which I think makes a lot of sense, is in order to study apraxia of speech, people compare populations with aphasia that either do have apraxia or that don't have apraxia, because it's so difficult to find the population that only has apraxia. This has been an approach. And a lot of those studies have been very promising. So particularly a lot of work that involves repeated production of sequences, and there's a lot of work about the principles of motor learning, which we'll get into a little bit later, has been promising. And what I mean by promising is that in a study of several individuals in a training paradigm or treatment paradigm, several of them improve, but several of them don't improve. And this is relatively widely reported in this literature. And again, a very reasonable response to this, very reasonable way to think of this, is that this is a very variable disorder in general. And so because there's this variable presentation, maybe that's why not all individuals improve. So one of the questions that I've been interested in general is when we have this variability in populations, is there some structure to that variability? And can we, within this kind of case, can we predict the responsiveness to the intervention because there is structure in that variability? So I'm going to actually move to a little bit of an overview of psycholinguistic accounts of how languages, how words are produced in order to then come up with some predictions that come from that way of talking about it that will give us a way to think about the errors that we're seeing in these impaired individuals. So when I say psycholinguistic accounts, I really just mean these sort of information processing accounts that describe the different computational steps that are involved in speech and language production. So there's a lot of debate over many of the aspects of these accounts. What I'm going to try to focus on are some areas that are maybe slightly less debate, although I'm sure that the precise way that I've laid these things out will be different from in some accounts versus others. So the idea is that in order to produce words like spoon or pan, the lexical item has to be retrieved from long-term memory. Once that item is retrieved from long-term memory, which contains some sort of sparse representation of the sounds, there's then a process which is often called phonological encoding, although it's called different things in different frameworks, which maps from these sort of long-term memory representations into something with a little bit more phonological detail. So for example, for a word like spoon, sorry, I'm going to try to do the laser pointer function. So for a word like spoon, it gets mapped onto a single syllable that has the S and the P in the onset position of the syllable, whereas for a word like pan, it gets mapped onto a syllable that just has a singleton P. You'll notice that these P's are written differently, so the P in a word like pan is aspirated, P, whereas the P in a word like spoon is unaspirated, and actually if you isolate that sound, it sounds like a B in English. It sounds like the way English speakers produce a B. So this is part of this phonological process, is sort of this labification and specifying which allophone is going to be produced. And then that serves as the input to some sort of motor planning or motor programming process, which then takes this detailed phonological representation and generates some sort of motor plan. So I've used one very specific type of representation here that just shows something that the idea of these motor representations is that there's overlap in both space and in time of the different articulators that can be represented in these motor representations. So, and there's some sort of, there's additional processing beyond that. Obviously, we have to actually execute these motor movements with our articulators, but this is a sort of general framework, and there seems to be relatively widespread agreement that there's something somewhat phonological and there's something somewhat motor. There are some differences in how people think about their interaction, how the degree to which they interact, but there's still this sort of general idea that there are these different systems. So how do we think about the errors that might occur? The idea when we have these different computations that are taking place in order to produce language is that errors can arise at different levels in those computations. So as I said, I focus typically on consonant clusters, and so the example that I'm going to go through here looks at two different ways that somebody could make an error in producing the word spoon. So one possibility is that somebody could make a phonological error in spoon, and what I mean by that is an error that occurs during that phonological encoding process. So the idea here is that rather than coming up with the syllable that had the S and the P in the onset, we have a syllable that just has the singleton, P in the onset, and so then because there's just the single P in the onset, it'll be produced with aspiration, so we would hear that sounding like poon, and so then if that error occurs in the phonological processing, what we would expect essentially is that the motor plan is going to be based on this representation, and so when these errors occur, the output should have the timing of a singleton sound, because that's what it's being based on. So in a case like this, it would be produced like P in American English. Another possibility, though, is that the phonological processing system doesn't make an error, and the error occurs in the motor planning system when it comes to these deletion errors. So here we could imagine that the phonological processing system has still yielded this correct syllable spoon that has the S and the P in the onset position, and then in the motor planning, then an error occurs, something happens, and the articulation associated with the S is deleted, but the timing is maintained. And so then we wind up with an output that is produced with the timing of a cluster, which actually for this kind of case would sound like a B in English, because it's produced with that sort of shorter version that would have been overlapped with the S. So in the case of the phonological errors, because the motor plan is based upon the syllable with just one consonant in it, we get the timing of the singleton. In the case of the motor errors, because the motor plan is based on the timing that has a cluster in the onset, then we get the timing that sounds like a cluster, and so we would get the B sound. That's the general idea here. So we've been exploring this for a while. I'm going to talk quickly about some of the earlier investigations into this, and then how we've been expanding it recently. So our earlier investigations looked at a couple of individuals who made very frequent errors in these kinds of S-stop clusters in both spontaneous speech and in picture naming, repetition tasks, and so forth. And the data that I'm going to present come from repetition tasks. So both of these individuals made these S-stop errors where they deleted the S. When they said this word, there was no S in there. And so recall the predictions is that from those accounts is that the errors that arise in phonology should be produced like a singleton, which would sound like a P, whereas the errors that arise in the motor planning should be produced and sound like the sound in the cluster, more like a B. So we have these two individuals. We have 160 of these S deletion errors for subject 1, 57 for subject 2. And so for every word, we're going to use a better trio, every word like speech, we recorded them saying speech where they deleted the S, and then we also recorded peach and beach. And so the idea is that the word peach has the timing of the singleton, and the word beach has the timing of the cluster. And so for these individuals, these are the green bars here represent the timing of the singleton, so the aspirated stops, and the red bars represent the timing of the timing associated with the cluster, which is the unaspirated stops. So this is just their timing on their singletons, and this is the way that they produced their deletions. So one individual produced the deletions that, over all of the tokens were not distinct from that of the singletons. So there would be aspirated stops in those, whereas the other person over all these tokens produced something that sounded like the unaspirated stops, had the timing of the cluster. These analyses were a little more detailed than what I'm just showing here, but this is just an overview of this. So we were somewhat excited that this sort of shared these predictions from these accounts, but this is just the way their errors looked. What we first got really more interested in, actually, was what happened. We were testing these individuals week after week, trying to get a lot of errors so we can compare these things and have really robust analyses on these acoustic analyses. And we tested them week after week for about 6 months, each of them. The individual who made phonological errors, meaning that the timing of those s-stop errors matched that of the singletons, that individual did not change in his performance and his cluster production performance over time. Whereas the other individual, just in these week after week repetition sessions that involved basically 45 minutes to an hour of word production of these words that contain these complex sequences, these consonant clusters, just started producing them better. And at first this was like, we need these errors, we need to do these measurements, and then there was this, you know, oh, it's good that somebody is improving. That's sort of one of those moments. So we were somewhat excited by this, and we worked on, we published this work about a year or so afterwards, maybe I think it was about a year and a half actually. We just decided to, participant S2 was still in the clinic and we still had access to him. We decided to test him again on the words that he had done just in those last 2 sessions, to see, you know, how was his performance at that point. You know, a year and a half later, we hadn't been doing this kind of work with him. How was his performance on producing these words with clusters? And it was basically at exactly the same level that his production had been when we had stopped seeing him. So I hope you'll agree that he earned a gold star for doing that work, for continuing, for maintaining that kind of performance. And it made us think that maybe what was happening here was actually learning had occurred. It wasn't just a practice effect, which is the way we might think of something like this, but maybe some sort of learning had occurred. And so this sort of led to the next step of the investigation, which is something we did sort of after that point. We decided to look at this a little bit more in depth, to look at additional participants, to not limit ourselves to this one kind of cluster error, because we looked a lot for people who made these errors. They're really easy to score. They're really easy to think about. If it sounds like a P, it's one thing. If it sounds like a V, it's the other. And they just weren't as common as we had hoped. So we developed acoustic measures to look at a variety of different cluster errors rather than just focusing on that one. And the idea here was we wanted to systematically investigate this kind of just straightforward repetition-based improvement. And so what we really wanted to do was not even go in and say, I think this person's going to improve and be a motor person. I think this person's going to not. We wanted to take see them for about 12 weeks, which is what we wound up doing, and do these weekly repetition sessions. And from the same data, we wanted to identify what their errors look like and figure out if there was improvement, rather than sort of pre-sorting them in some way. So we used a very straightforward paradigm here, where we had it sort of at the core here. In the middle is these 8 weekly repetition sessions, where we had we had a word list consisted of 188 words of a variety of different cluster types that we were going to be able to analyze the different kinds of errors that people made. And we had a pre-test session, 2 pre-test sessions and 2 post-test sessions. And those contained what we called our baseline list, which was those same trained words as well as matched untrained words for each of those clusters. It was actually matched words for each word that were frequency matched, and then some additional filler words as well. So the reason, you know, this is just a very straightforward repetition task. So in some way, it seems funny for us to even sort of be thinking of this as intervention exactly. But we had sort of realized this already, that even the kind of tasks that we were doing followed the way that people have been working on structuring the practice of tasks in this principles of motor learning literature. So there's this literature on how how motor learning proceeds that comes from the non-speech world, which people have been looking at in the speech world more recently, and that sort of revolves around the ways people structure the practice sessions that you have people do and the way you structure the feedback that you give people. And we'd sort of already realized that the way we were structuring these practice sessions really matched what that literature says about the best ways to encourage motor learning, which is that, first of all, there was a lot of it, which is obviously sort of going to be one of the most important things. There was a large amount of practice. It was distributed over many sessions. We had a lot of different words. It wasn't just that we're having the person say, please, 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 each each time. There's a lot of different words with each sound, and they were randomly mixed together. And that all of these are ways that actually seem to be able to encourage motor learning. We did not provide explicit feedback for these individuals. There's a thought out there, which I think makes a lot of sense, that there's probably some feedback that people get just from producing these words, especially in a repetition task, but we didn't provide any additional explicit feedback. Okay, so we have this data, which if you sort of count 432 times 4 plus 188 times 10 times 8, you realize that we recorded about 2,500 words from these individuals, and so we were looking for the errors. We were looking for errors to try to figure out which type of error they made predominantly, and then we were also going to compare the difference in their performance from this pre-test to the post-test and look at sort of both the trained items and the untrained items. So in terms of looking at the errors, we did stick with deletion errors because we had what we thought a pretty clean way to think about them. They're also, for individuals who make a lot of distortions in their production, it's a little bit easier to look at deletions because something's just frankly not there. So it's a little bit easier to sort of measure things when something else isn't there. So for each time somebody made an error, like the word snail, like trying to produce the word snail and producing it without the S, producing something that sounds like nail, we looked at three things when we could. We looked at the duration of that N in that error token when it was supposed to be snail and it was produced as nail. We looked at the duration of that N in a correctly produced snail, which we had most of the time because each word was produced at least 8 times, and some of them were produced, each word was produced at least 4 times for the baseline words, and then a lot of them were produced 12 times because they were in both the baseline lists and the other lists. So we were able to look at the duration of the sound when the word was wrong, when the S was deleted, the duration of the sound when the word was right, and also the duration of the sound in a singleton. So in English, as happens in a lot of languages, in a consonant cluster, like at the beginning of the word snail, that N in snail is shorter than the N in nail. And just so you don't have dissonance, I'll say it the other way because I know it says it in the slide. The N in nail, the N as the singleton, is longer than the N in a cluster, mostly because of overlap in how these things are produced. So again, we have the logic that we were using followed the same as in this previous work, where the idea is that if somebody makes an error in this phonological encoding process, then when they go to come up with a motor plan, they're doing that based upon a singleton. And so then the errors, the words that were supposed to be snail and were produced with an error, those should have a long N, just like a singleton would. So that N should be longer, the N in the error should be longer than the N in the correctly produced cluster word. In contrast, for those who are for errors that arise in the motor level, the timing, they're still trying to come up with a motor plan based upon the idea that there's a cluster there, and so the timing that they're trying to produce should be based upon that cluster, and so therefore it should be shorter than the singleton. So now for those errors, the N in the error should be the same as the N in the correctly produced cluster, and should be shorter than the N in the singleton word. So we had 4 individuals who, again, we weren't pre-sorting. We were trying to run this on more individuals, and we have some interesting ways that we're trying to do that now. So we were looking for individuals who made cluster errors, because otherwise this wouldn't have been a very fun task for anybody. We also, because we're using a repetition task, we did a lot of screening for auditory perception to make sure that the problems were in production and not in auditory perception. So we have these 4 individuals. They all made cluster errors. Most of them made deletion errors in both onset and coda. Some of them made errors only in onset or only in coda, but the same principles apply. And they all had at least some of these apraxia of speech hallmarks that I mentioned before. So their speech was dysprosodic. It was slower rate than typical, and contained a lot of distortions in both correctly produced and incorrectly produced segments. So these were the 4 individuals, and they actually grouped into 2 and 2 in each category based upon their errors. So I'm just going to try to walk you through this a little bit. So so these are the predictions again. The phonological errors, the deletion should be similar to the singleton and longer than the cluster. For P1, we see that this bar here, and these are going to all look the same. So we'll focus on this one first, and then we can see the others. For the soda, the singleton, the duration of the sounds as singletons is here. The duration of the sound as a cluster is there, and this is the duration of the sounds in deletions. And just so you can hear a little bit what this sounds like, I have a production. This is actually from an S-stop cluster because those are a lot easier for us to hear the difference and to think about, so you'll see what I mean. I should have said this first, that it's going to be the examiner who's not wearing the microphone first, so that person sounds more distant, followed by the individual with the deficit who's wearing a head-mounted mic. So you can hear that the target here is spunk. And the output sounds like this aspirated P. It sounds like she's saying punk. So it's not the case that the errors here are all these S-stop clusters. It's just easier, I think, for us to hear that than it is for us to hear a short N versus a long N. It's just not something we're accustomed to perceiving. A second individual made 23 of these deletion errors. We were unable to get him to come back and record all the singletons that we needed, but we can see again that there was this clear distinction between these. In the deletions, the remaining sound was long compared to in the singletons, and here's an error from him. Again, you can hear what sounds clearly like okay, but these are things that are being measured offline. Then we had two individuals whose errors fit the other pattern. So when they made deletion errors, the deletion fit the timing of the cluster as opposed to the timing of the singleton. And again, the idea here is that we think that the phonological processing went okay. They're trying to produce the word with the cluster, and the error is arising in that motor planning system. So I should have probably belabored this on the last slide, which I didn't. They all have some symptoms of apraxia and of aphasia, and they would all receive this diagnosis, which is both apraxia and aphasia. So these are distinctions within that broader class. And so here is an error from him. Let me see if I can get any louder. The target is spool. And hopefully you can hear, both in here and online, that it really does sound like a B there, and that's again just something that's perceptual for us. But the errors all fit this pattern where the timing of those deletions were similar to the timing of the clusters. We have a fourth participant who did exactly the same thing. He only made errors in clusters though, so there's no beautiful illustrative example for me to play for you that would make it really clear, so I'm going to leave that one out. But you can see that his pattern, again, fits exactly that of P3. So we have these two individuals who make errors that fit this pattern of the phonological errors, as we described, and two that make fit the pattern of the motor errors. So now what I'm going to present here is their change in performance from that pre-test to the post-test. This is just a simple % change in their performance from the pre-test to the post-test. And so for each person, we'll look at both the change in the trained words and the untrained words. So first I'm going to present the two individuals who made phonological errors. So they showed small improvements on the trained words. They showed small decrements on the untrained words. None of these were statistically different from no change in the statistical analyses. So the two individuals who made phonological errors, I mean, you can see they're not doing the exact same thing every time they're producing things, but they are not really benefiting from this sort of repetition-based training. And then when you look at our two individuals who made these errors that look more like these motor errors, they showed tremendous improvement between the pre-test and the post-test of just having these repetition sessions week after week. So again, the idea again here was that we were trying to not sort them to begin with and see if the types of errors they made also fit whether they benefited or not from this kind of motor, this kind of repetition task. And we did see a big benefit for those individuals, and these are significant benefits for the individuals who made motor errors and not for the other individuals. So I think, one thing that I take away from this is that error quality, even defined by these sort of psycholinguistic models, can actually be clinically meaningful. It can help to predict whether someone is going to benefit or not from a specific type of intervention. And not in any one error, it's possible that any one error could go a certain way, but we're looking at 20, 30, 40 errors over an individual. The predominant error types are predicting their responsiveness to treatment. So we have a number of next steps. We've developed a really simple web-based platform where people can do the training part at home on their own, where we're not recording them in that case during those sessions, but we can actually keep track of whether they've done it. It'll record whether people have gone through each word, how many times they've listened to each word, and I can show that at the end of the talk if people are interested. So this is just a way to try to test this a little bit more widely. We would probably still have to, do pre-tests or post-tests and maybe design it a little bit differently before and after, but this would be an easy way to test this a little bit more widely. I'm very interested in sort of the limitations here. I mean, this is such a straightforward, just repetition approach, and so what are the things, even within the people who are benefiting, are there certain sequences that they are more likely to benefit on or not? And we've done some of that looking under the hood, and it does seem like there are some sequences that are still difficult, that are sort of recalcitrant. They're not able to improve just based on this, so maybe they need a little bit more encouragement. Another question is, since these individuals do probably have, since they have both deficits and they probably have errors that are sometimes arising from both levels, is it possible that one type of error is sort of improving and going away, but the other type of error is unaffected by this, and to try to tease that apart a little bit more. So these are some next steps of this direct work. But another direction that we have is sort of whether we can take these kind of training effects that we've seen and enhance them in some way. And the idea here is to potentially use non-invasive brain stimulation, to use TDCS to try to enhance these effects. And so this brings us to the second part of the presentation, where we're going to look at sort of whether we can enhance speech motor learning using non-invasive brain stimulation. So this is a really broad question in post-stroke research in general, in individuals who study mobility, study language, study speech. Can we enhance training effects? And the reason it's so important is because the targeted treatments we do may help to some degree, but it is limited, and the gains are often slow. They're often, not always, but often limited to trained items, where they don't generalize to other items so well. The maintenance, I don't maintain it a little harsh, but the maintenance is often relatively poor as well in terms of looking 6 months after treatment, a year after treatment, whether people have still improved. And so any way that we can enhance these treatment effects is of course going to be something we would really like to be able to do. And I think this is where the excitement behind TDCS has come from, behind using non-invasive brain stimulation. So the idea here is that we would try to help encourage encourage learning and better treatment effects in individuals post-stroke using brain stimulation. And part of why this has been an area people look is that there's been somewhat promising results for post-stroke rehab in both limb motor impairment, so individuals who have hemiplegia or mild hemiplegias who are learning to reuse their limbs, as well as aphasia treatment, especially naming-based aphasia treatment, where this has been looked at for a while, and these are just a couple of examples of a growing literature. For those, I guess, in the audience who might not be as familiar with TDCS, just to sort of tease it apart, transcranial means it's through the scalp, so it's non-invasive, and it's relatively easy to do, easy to set up, well tolerated. So this is another reason this has been sort of exciting. It's relatively cheap as far as these things go, and all of these things have, I think, led to some of the excitement behind it. And what happens is that in TDCS, there's a constant low-intensity current that flows through the electrodes on the scalp. And so, so there's an anode and a cathode that are placed on the scalp in a particular montage, and they're connected to a current generator. And it doesn't cause neurons to fire, but it has either hyperpolarizing effect near the cathode or a depolarizing effect near the anode. tends to be that the location that people place these electrodes on the scalp is determined by the desired stimulation location, which is going to be different for different kinds of tasks, whether it's a motor task, a language task, a cognitive task. It also gets used in other domains such as depression research and schizophrenia research. This image here is sort of a simulation of how the current might be affecting the cortex of this montage here with the anode over the left motor cortex and the cathode over the right supraorbital area. The warm colors are the areas that are receiving stimulation, and I think what's notable here is that it's diffuse. There is stimulation throughout large portions of the brain. It's not very focused, and I think we as a field are still trying to figure out whether this is a feature or a bug of this approach. So in terms of using this kind of stimulation to enhance outcomes, I think the main approach here has been to use it as an adjunct to a treatment. It's not that you're just stimulating the brain and hoping that people are better. You're stimulating the brain and you're pairing that in a specific way with a treatment, and you're beginning hopefully with a treatment that will enhance performance. So you want to take something that works and make it work a little bit better, or hopefully a lot better. So you take a treatment that enhances performance and you pair it with TDCS, and then you can compare the performance of when people have this stimulation, the active stimulation paired with the treatment versus a sham stimulation condition paired with the treatment. So as I said, this has been looked at a bit in arm-based hemiplegias as well as in aphasia, and it really hasn't been assessed much in the speech motor learning domain, particularly in the post-stroke speech motor learning domain, and so that's where the work that we're doing is going to go, although the data that I'm going to talk about today is not actually with impaired individuals, and we'll get there in a sec. So there's a lot of different parameters. It's a very simple device, as you saw, especially I'm using that one anode, one cathode setup like the one that was there. It's a very simple setup, but for something so simple, there's a lot of different parameters in terms of how we can set it up and how these might affect what happens are questions that are still open questions in the field. So there's issues like the electrode montage, exactly where do you place the anode and the cathode, and also are you using just a single anode and a single cathode or something different? People have looked at the different current levels, so the current levels are very low. They tend to range from 1 milliamp to 2 milliamps, but does it matter within that range? What is the treatment or training approach that you're pairing it with, and how important, how does that sort of interact with TDCS? What are the outcome measures that you're using? So these are all important. The issue that I'm going to focus on today, because I think it fits well in looking at speech motor learning, is the issue of timing. And what I mean by that is the relative timing of the stimulation from TDCS and the kind of training, the kind of treatment task that we're going to be doing, or training task that we would be doing in speech motor learning. So the reason that we've sort of been interested in this timing question is that there's at least some evidence that the timing of TDCS relative to the training affects the impact of how TDCS will improve or not improve motor treatment. So Jacoby et al. 2003, they looked at one of these studies where people have upper extremity problems, and they use this robotic arm to try to learn to move their arms more, and they wanted to compare, did it matter when they were stimulating relative to that task, and they were comparing a sham and stimulating prior to the task, during the task, and even after the task. And I think what was really notable in their results, this is just a figure from that paper, and what was really notable is that the training plus the TDCS before the task led to improvement, whereas the training plus the TDCS during and after the task did not, at least in one measure in terms of their arm movement. So this, and this has actually driven some of the work that has been done where in looking at individuals who have this upper extremity problem, some of the work now gets done with the TDCS happening first, the stimulation happening first for 20 minutes, followed by then the robotic arm stimulation. So in the studies in aphasia and language processing, I think more generally, it just hasn't been pulled apart, and I think there's been no reason to pull it apart. And the reason why is that there have been some reasonable findings, I think, in this literature, at least encouraging findings in this literature. So typically what happens is that TDCS and some sort of aphasia treatment happen at the same time. They either happen both for exactly 20 minutes or exactly the same duration, or the stimulation lasts for 20 minutes and it begins at the beginning of the treatment, and then the treatment continues longer than that. I don't know of any study that's then tried to look at, well, is there a difference between the performance on the things that people did afterwards versus the performance on what they did beforehand, and it depends upon how the treatment setup is working, whether you could even do something like that. But I think the idea from the language world is that doing them at the same time has been okay. There's been no reason to decouple it. So it hasn't been addressed systematically, and that's because there hasn't been a need to, because simultaneous treatment plus TDCS has helped, whereas in the more motor-based literature, it's at least in the one study, it seemed like it did not help and didn't help to the same degree, and having the stimulation prior to the task was much more helpful. And so I think, as we think about how we're going to take this kind of work and do it with individuals with impairment, it might be nice, since we're looking at a domain, the speech motor learning domain, which has properties of motor learning and also properties of sort of language processing and speech and language processing, that it's nice to be able to try to figure this out before we have people coming in and doing 20 sessions of stimulation with them. And so this has driven the approach that we have here of trying to look at unimpaired individuals first. They're a lot sort of easier, cheaper to run a lot of those individuals, figure out whether timing matters, and then be able to use that finding to drive the more clinically based research. So this is what the second part of the talk really is going to focus on, is a paradigm that we've developed and run, looking at unimpaired speakers who are learning to produce non-native English consonant clusters. So if we have unimpaired speakers producing native English consonant clusters, they're going to do okay, and we're not going to have a whole lot to look at. So we tried to have something that would involve motor learning in some way, that it wouldn't just be practicing a non-word that it totally fits with all the properties of English, that they would actually have to learn to do something in some way. So we're interested in, can TDCS enhance this, and is there a difference between the performance when people are stimulated before a training or stimulated during a training? So the task that we used, we have this non-native consonant cluster production task, learning task. So this all involved bisyllabic non-words with consonant clusters that are not found in English, some of which are somewhat easier for native English speakers to produce, like the FN cluster, which here is a recording. This is actually, the recordings that I'll play on this slide are the speaker. That is the speaker who we had recorded. In order to present these to individuals, we came up with the spelling because we didn't want them to just rely on their perception, but we also presented an auditory production. So they're hearing a simultaneous Russian-English, simultaneous bilingual Russian-English speaker producing these, because Russian either has these clusters or they tend to be okay in Russian. And so people are hearing and they're seeing Sniku on the screen. They're seeing this first thing on the screen, and that's the model that they're trying to produce. And so FN, as I said, is a little bit easier. So here's one of the harder ones. It can be really difficult, probably even for the people in the room who are listening on the speaker, and even probably more so for the people online, to hear that there's actually a G at the beginning there, and that is a GD cluster, because I almost now, even knowing exactly what it is, I still heard dog poop. I heard just the D. If we sit down, we open in the prompt, we'll all see that there's really a G there as well. So these were all, and actually when you wear headphones, you hear these things a little bit better too. So these were recorded by a bilingual Russian-English speaker. We had 80 English participants who went through the study. We wanted to make sure they didn't know anything about phonetics, so that they couldn't come up with these. We didn't want them to be able to come up with, at least even in their heads, these like IPA transcriptions of what they were hearing, because it probably gives you some benefit. I mean, some of us might still say Sabaro, but it's still like, there's still like some benefit to knowing how to transcribe things in order to be able to produce it. So we wanted people to have no experience with phonetics, no formal phonetics training, and also not have had any language exposure to a language that includes any of these clusters, so no Slavic languages, Greek, German, and a couple other languages that we excluded. We had all native English speakers, but obviously people, especially in New York, can be exposed to other languages as well, and so those were the languages we were avoiding. So, so the procedure that we used here in terms of the motor learning task, we had just a 20-minute session, and it was obviously designed to be 20 minutes so that it would fit with the stimulation timing, where we did a very short, what people call in this literature, pre-practice, where they're producing a couple of these items, and we're giving them pretty detailed feedback on what they're doing. They're producing a couple of the ones that we're better at hearing. So the other thing, not only are English speakers pretty bad at producing these things, but English speakers are really bad at perceiving these things too. And so that'll actually be, as I'll say in a minute, we didn't provide feedback because it would have just been all over the place, and it would have been worse for them to get our messed up native English speaking feedback than it would be to just have their own feedback. So in pre-practice, they produced a couple of these words where we gave them some pretty detailed feedback on exactly what they did and how they did it. And then we just moved to this practice session. They had, remember, there were 8 of these clusters. So for each of those clusters, there were 4 of these non-words that we did in that session, and they did them 5 times each. They were all obviously mixed together, and we had some singletons that were thrown in there that we were going to use for later acoustic analyses. There was no feedback provided. And the way we did this, the first half of that practice was just the baseline session for them. We then had 2 retention sessions that we looked at whether their performance changed over time. One was 30 minutes later, and so this figure is not chronologically correct. So one was 30 minutes later, and the other one was 2 days later. So all 80 of these people came back for a second session 2 days later, and those sessions were all the same. They produced the same 4 non-words with each cluster that they had been trained on, plus 4 additional non-words with each cluster, as well as some singletons. And every time they were presented with these non-words, they were presented both orally and orthographically, so that we weren't relying on their perception, because the subject's perception would be as poor as ours. So we also sort of filled some time with some additional testing and so forth, and we provided TBCS stimulation either before or during that task. So we had 20 minutes of working memory and other cognitive testing at the beginning, and so individuals were either, everybody had the TBCS put on at the very beginning, and then for half of the participants, they received TBCS during this time, and for half, they received it during this time. But of course, of each of those halves, there's an active and a sham for different participants. So the TBCS procedure, we used a 1x1 device with a 5x7 saline soaked sponge. And the anode was placed over C3 in the 1020 EEG space, and the cathode was, which is, people describe as the motor cortex, and the cathode was placed over the right supraorbital region. And as I said, there's active and sham for each condition. So there were 20 participants who received active stimulation before the task, 20 received sham before the task, 20 received active during the task, and 20 received sham during the task. So the outcome measures that we looked at were both cluster accuracy and word accuracy, although words are non-words like niku, but we looked at either just cluster accuracy and also at whole word accuracy. So I've already said we're pretty bad at hearing these things, so if I just had my army of students sitting in the room scoring these, then it would probably be pretty inconsistent with one another. And so we use a system that others have used in linguistics that we thought of as acoustically informed transcription. So there's a really common kind of error that probably all of you have been reciting these in your head already, can figure out what people typically do. So people typically say something like, so in fnidu, for example, people typically say fnidu. If they make an error, they put that vowel in between the 2 consonants. And this is referred to as an epenthesis error. You're adding that schwa in between the 2. Another error that you do get quite a bit is fnidu, where the vowel gets put at the beginning and now you have a syllable boundary between the F and the N. Speakers of Spanish will probably be familiar with that general process because that happens a lot in loanwords for Spanish speakers. So we were, a lot of what we're doing is trying to figure out, is there a vowel in there or not? This is can be difficult with FNIDU, can be really difficult with the GV clusters, and so we needed a way to do it that was a little bit more than just using our ears. So we used the spectrogram to identify whether there was a vowel or not. The idea was if there was a vowel, if there was a vocoid, something that repeats in the waveform, and I'll show you this on the next slide, and there was formant structure that shows that there's some resonance in the vocal cavity, then we would consider that a vowel. And again, we were treating the first half of practice as baseline. So this is an accurately produced sequence, and this is actually from our speaker. So this is an F followed by an N, and there's really nothing in between there over here that could be seen as a vowel. And so you can also probably hear, you can at least convince yourself that you hear that there's no vowel in there. And this is contrasted with somebody else who's trying to say fniku but produces schwa in there. And so I've highlighted that region so that you can see that there is both something repeating in the waveform, which is what the patterns associated with the vowel, as well as this formant structure in the spectrogram. And so this is what this one sounds like. And you can again convince yourself that you're hearing a epenthesis there, but you can imagine listening to these, and there were 65,000 of them total with the 80 participants and 800 items. So you can imagine that listening to these can be kind of difficult, and it's nice to have something that's systematic. We also had a nice setup where the people who were scoring these, doing this acoustically informed transcription, were blind to both what type of stimulation the person had had, and even when it was, whether they're looking at the beginning of the practice or the end of the retentions. They didn't know which items they were listening to. So people are really truly blind to the things that matter. So we analyze this with logistic mixed models. We look both at cluster accuracy and at word accuracy. We have fixed effects of the stimulation type, active versus sham, the session that we're looking at. So P1 is that first half of practice we're treating as baseline, and then P2 is the second half of practice, R1 is that 30-minute retention, and R2 is that 2-day later retention. So we're looking at the type of stimulation, the session that they're in, and the timing, whether they receive stimulation before or during the task. We also threw in there whether the item is trained or untrained, which actually never came out to matter at all in any of our models, and also the individual cluster, because we did have a hierarchy of difficulty intentionally, and so we threw that into them as well. And we have random effects for subject and word. We also have the interaction of those items, and that's what really matters for the question we're asking, unfortunately, is the three-way interaction, which nobody likes to think about or look at or talk about, but it is the thing that matters here, because we care about the type of stimulation, the change from that first session to the later sessions, and the timing with which the TDCS was applied, whether it's before or during. So I'm going to just show you this bar just so you can get a sense of the way I'm plotting the data. So those were the analyses, and when I put up stats, it'll be based upon those mixed models. I'm plotting the data in a slightly different way that I think is a little easier to wrap one's head around. So this bar here is the data from the sham before stimulation condition. And so what we're looking at is the change from that first part of practice to the second part of practice here, that half an hour later retention and that 2-day later retention session. And this is just the overall accuracy change in cluster accuracy for sham before the task. And now I've added on for sham during the task. So you can see, and those are actually, the model showed that those are actually improvements. Those are significant improvements relative to P1. So even though they're not huge, those are significant improvements. So not between these two conditions, but the difference between where they were at baseline and at these times are improvements. So everybody is improving at least to some degree. And the two shams, at least for cluster accuracy, look pretty identical. This is the active during condition, which showed a bigger improvement both in P2 and in R2 than the others, and those are not statistically significant. And this was the group that that received stimulation prior to the task. And this, especially the interaction at that point, was significant, meaning, and so again, I hate that it's a three-way interaction. There's no other way to really do it in this case. So this means that the improvement, the difference between the active and the sham groups mattered more, was bigger for the before condition than the during condition, especially at that time. It's significant at that time point, and it's partially significant or close at other time points. Just so you can see active versus sham. So this clearly tells a story that that condition is quite a bit better than the other conditions. If we had done a more straightforward active versus sham analysis, we would have seen something that looked quite different. And it does show, again, that one point is different, but I think this is why it's really important sometimes to try to decouple these things and pull them apart. When we look at word accuracy, we get essentially the same basic findings. So we get a bigger improvement for the active before group, for the group that's receiving active stimulation prior to the task, than any of the other groups, where it comes up as significant at that R1 time point. And again, if we were to look at active versus sham, it would look like active is always better than sham, but again, that doesn't quite tell the whole story with respect to this measure. So I think this is a task with unimpaired individuals. We hope that this idea will translate to impaired individuals, but we found a couple of things that I think are pretty important here. First, all groups improved with a pretty small amount of training, to be honest. The 20 minutes of training of producing these crazy clusters that are really difficult to produce. All the groups seem to improve, and there was no feedback. So that alone is pretty nice that we have this measure where we can see improvement. Overall, there was the improvement was greater for active versus sham, and that effect was really driven by the TDCS before the task group really improving greater than the others. And this idea is consistent with that non-speech motor literature, which has also shown that maybe the benefits are greater when you stimulate prior to the task than during the task. We have a number of ongoing analyses here. We have some acoustic analyses that I think will really help to strengthen this. First, to show that the errors that people make when they're saying finiku or gadivu, that those are getting better and better over time. So their errors are getting, those vowel errors are getting shorter and shorter over time. Another way to look at that people are getting better, not just overall accuracy, but also these acoustic measures. And of course, I mean, we haven't learned anything mechanistic from this. This is just sort of some data that I think are pretty cool, but we haven't learned anything mechanistic about why this might happen. And I think there's a number of different conditions that would be important to run at this point to try to think about why exactly we're getting this kind of change. So kind of to wrap up and hopefully bring these two together, hopefully you see how they fit together at this point, but in part of our work, we're trying to identify the participants that are most likely to benefit from motor-based repetition interventions. And so now that we sort of have a good sense, we certainly have a good starting point that if we're going to work with individuals with AOS, with these complex deficits who make motor errors, and we're going to try to use TDCS to enhance their performance, we should probably at least start by stimulating them before their treatment sessions as opposed to during their treatment sessions, given this result. So we have a number of single subject experimental designs planned here where we'll be doing this kind of repetition-based training. We'll probably add a little bit of feedback to that. And we're going to be doing crossover designs with these individuals. So they'll have a sham arm and an active arm counterbalanced. And of course, here we'll begin with TDCS before the sessions. So I'd like to thank the cadre of people that have made all these studies possible, and the funding agency, and me and our lab mascot, Cluster Columbus, would like to thank you for your time and attention.
If you want to take questions from the room, you repeat them after the
Sure.
So we talked about some of the variability in apraxia, and in the progressive apraxia literature, Deputy Joseph talked about apraxia types. Have you seen in your sample maybe some that have more episodic errors versus distortion errors? Do you think that is something that happens in stroke apraxia? There's not as much research in stroke literature or LPAP, but if that could explain some of those differences.
That's a really great question. I think I haven't done so much thinking about, sorry, the question was, it's just instructive. So the question was whether some subtypes that have been identified in the PPA literature associated with apraxia of speech, the primary progressive facial literature, might be sort of underlying. I think the question was really, is that potentially underlying some of these differences that we were seeing? And the answer is, it should look. I haven't actually done that level of work. It has been the case, and at least in the last 4, that there was a severity difference, that the 2 who made these errors that were more motor errors seem to be more severe in general on most apraxic measures. If it turns out to be that simple, then great. Then we have something really straightforward to use and to look at. I'm not sure that it's going to turn out to be that simple in terms of severity, and so that's something, classifying sort of the other types of errors that they're making that aren't these sort of frank cluster errors would be something that there is a lot of data for mining for that. So it's a great question. Yeah.
In your last slide, for your plan studies, you mentioned that you would do GCS before treatment. What are you going to have them do during that period with GCS? So
that's also a super important question. The question was, what will I have? That was a great question. So the question was, if I'm going to do 20 minutes of simulation prior to treatment, what am I going to have the people doing during that time? I think there's been a couple different approaches in the literature that's trying to look at this. So part of the literature that's really looked at this involves these upper extremity arm problems, so it's pretty easy to just avoid that for 20 minutes, which is what people have tended to do. One thing that people have done is have people just looking at pictures or listening to music or just something to like zone out essentially for 20 minutes. It's also the case that we just did a little battery of working memory and cognitive tasks with the participants whose data we're presenting here. Sorry, I know there's a faster way to do this, I was just off on the screen. So we just did sort of, this is like a Corsi block span, things that didn't involve spoken output, but involve some sort of language production. And since we know that doing that for 20 minutes seemed to help, it's another place to start. But of course, we're not going to do the same working memory task every session for 15 sessions.
Yeah, I'm just curious if doing anything would show the same thing.
I am too.
It's
one of the conditions that I think we're going to try to run with unimpaired individuals as well is to play with what people are doing and see whether that can play a role.
So to me, it seems pretty obvious what you should do. You should be doing treatment in those first 20 minutes because you're already getting an effect. And if what seems to be what you're showing is that there's actually greater effect after. Start doing treatment, stop the stimulation, continue that treatment. It seems to me like these are people who actually have lives, who want to maximize their output.
Right.
I think that for us as scientists, let's do all kinds of stuff, but ultimately what we need to do is to give them as much treatment as possible. That's what I would do.
So I think the reason that we would think about maybe not treating is this difference between the 2 green bars here, right? That we are getting a much greater learning effect for
but you're assuming that this is going to translate into rehab.
Of course. And so we don't know if this is going to translate into rehab. So it's also possible that if we did 20 minutes of stimulation without treatment and then 40 minutes of treatment after the stimulation, that would also, be even better. I mean, it's a point well taken. And something to. Yeah.
It almost, this reminds me a little bit about the stuff Binman did in the 1960s with rats with TBCS and everything. And I wonder if, humans have thick skulls, we're pretty far away. It almost seems like we're trying to work out the timing, the dosage, the duration, and it seems like we have a lot of levers that we don't really know where to set.
Right.
What's your sense of maybe thinking about motor studies you could do with animals just to tell you where to set these things? Humans are kind of costly. They're doing other things in their lives. Is this the best place to start with trying to work out all these different variables and decouple them?
That's a very interesting question. So the question was, whether we should be considering trying to look at some of these really basic science questions, these variables, and how to set PDCS in animal model rather than in a human model, which is, I guess, undergrads, I guess. Maybe there's a question of which category that falls into. Just kidding, any undergrads who are listening. So I mean, I don't know what the right answer is to that. Partially, I'm not very well versed in the animal model literature in this domain. I guess the issue that Julius just raised in the last question about the sort of, we're assuming that the translation from these unimpaired individuals learning these clusters to the impaired individuals during treatment, we're assuming that might be somewhat straightforward, and we don't really know. I guess we have the same issue, of course, with the animals plus the brains being, I don't know, in terms of like the stimulation sites and the amount of current and issues like that, given the differences in brains. I don't know how much, honestly, if somebody out there wants to think about that kind of issue, especially in something like motor learning, which could be looked at relatively probably straightforwardly in the animal model rather than word finding and naming, which would be a little more difficult, that would be an interesting place to start to try to see if these things really extend. It's a great question. Yeah.
So the data you showed us is very interesting to me, especially for the part that you showed that the two patients in the more impaired group are the ones that actually more benefit from the repetition training tasks. So just wanted to ask you about the insights about, because in the context of the dorsal stream network, it appears that these kind of like repetition tasks are having an effect in perhaps improving this interaction between the sensory motor system. And it appears that based on the data, this is only working for the speech motor network, and it doesn't necessarily have a direct effect on the language processing. So the ones in the phonological impaired group are not the ones who actually benefit from the repetition task. So I just wanted you to see if we have any comments from that perspective.
Right. So the question is, it's focusing on the idea that only the motor individuals are improving, the individuals who primarily make motor errors are improving, and not the individuals who primarily make phonological errors, and given the insights that we've had recently about the neural processing of, in even something like a repetition task, why wouldn't the phonological group improve, or do I have any thoughts about that? I think the best thing I can do in terms of an answer is to pivot to some of the things that we've seen in the individuals who do make phonological errors that might seem to play a role in helping them improve. I'm not sure that I'm good at thinking about the relationship between this task and the dorsal stream question. But we did find that there was something that reduced the errors of the individuals who made phonological errors in that first study that I talked about. And that was something sort of painfully simple, which is these are the individuals who, trying to say spoon, the one person would say poon. So he would say the version that had the aspirated P. And we discovered something first accidentally and then sort of looked at it in depth, where if we basically just gave him a schwa, we just said, say a spoon instead of saying spoon, then that individual whose errors were assuming or arising during the stage where resyllabification takes place would then syllabify the S with the schwa, and then say a spoon, and would actually still be producing the aspirated version of the P because it was still its own sound and syllable. But he would, so when given the article when given the schwa he then stopped, basically was always producing the S. So he was doing it in a little bit of a funny way. We don't, English speakers put the S and the P in the same syllable, and so it would still say a spoon, and he's saying a spoon, but it still allowed him to produce the S. So in terms of like thinking about the computations that are involved in that error and sort of the levels that might help, the ways that we might help people make fewer errors who have that kind of error, it does seem like sort of a different level of computation. Now, how that relates to to these other issues is something that I'm not qualified to really respond on at this point. Would be my response.